Okay, so we're taking a deep dive today into India's IT sector. And, there's been a lot of talk lately about a downturn, a bit of a roller coaster ride. But we're going to go beyond those headlines and really try to unpack what's happening.
It's interesting because this isn't just some isolated story about stock prices or market trends, right? India's IT sector is really a vital part of the country's economy. It's a major employer, a global player, and these shifts have ripple effects that we need to kind of wrap our heads around.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're talking about big names like TCS, Infosys, and Wipro seeing their stock prices take a hit. Some of them, like pretty significant drops, maybe even 30% in some cases. And it's making people nervous because this sector's, well, it's a pretty important part of the Indian economy.
One of the things that's really spooking investors is this possibility of a recession looming in the U.S. And the Indian IT industry is heavily reliant on American companies for business, so any kind of slowdown there, well, it sends shockwaves all the way over to India.
It's a bit like a delicate ecosystem, isn't it? If U.S. companies start tightening their belts and cutting back on their IT budgets, Indian IT firms are definitely going to feel the squeeze. It's a lot of pressure riding on one market.
Absolutely. And it's not just hypothetical. We're already seeing this play out in the numbers. Like revenue projections for some of these Indian IT giants have been slashed. Some analysts are predicting growth as low as 4.5% in the next few years. And that's a huge difference from the double-digit growth that investors were used to.
So I'm curious, what does this mean for the people actually working in the IT sector in India? Are we talking about potential job losses here?
It's definitely a legitimate concern. When revenues slow down, companies often look to cut costs. And, well, personnel is a big expense. Even a small percentage of job losses in a sector that employs, millions of people, it can have a really big impact.
Yeah, it's unsettling for sure. And
Yeah.
especially with some of these other factors at play. I mean, artificial intelligence, AI, that's becoming a real force, right?
Yeah.
It's super exciting, but also kind of changing the game for traditional IT services.
AI is, yeah, it's a game changer for sure. And while it offers a lot of amazing possibilities, it's also creating some anxiety in the traditional IT world. Companies they're pouring money into these AI solutions that can basically automate tasks that used to be done by people. And this shift towards automation, it could mean less reliance on traditional IT outsourcing, which has been like the bread and butter for a lot of Indian IT firms.
Okay, so help me understand this. Let's say a company used to rely on a whole team of IT specialists in India to manage their customer service emails,
Right.
right? Now they can implement an AI chatbot that handles all those inquiries automatically. Fewer humans are needed, which means less outsourcing. Is that kind of the disruption we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a perfect example. It shows how AI is not just some futuristic concept. It's already reshaping the industry and, impacting jobs as we speak. And this brings us to another interesting piece of the puzzle. Even with the stock market dip, some analysts are saying that IT stocks are still overpriced.
That's interesting, right? It's like a car that's been in a fender bender, but they're still trying to sell it for the original price. What's the logic there?
To understand that, we got to look at the price to earnings ratio, or PE ratio for short. It basically tells you how much investors are willing to pay for each dollar of a company's earnings. A higher PE ratio usually means investors are pretty optimistic about future growth.
So if a company has a high PE ratio right now, it means investors are still betting on big growth, even though things are looking kind of shaky.
Exactly. And right now, the Nifty IT index, which tracks the performance of these major Indian IT companies, it has a PE ratio that's significantly higher than the average for the broader market. So that suggests that, investors might be holding on to expectations that don't quite match up with the current situation.
So that's kind of a red flag for potential investors, right? Like that gap between expectations and reality, it could lead to further drops in stock prices as things settle down.
Yeah, you got it. And this isn't just happening in India. Global IT giants like Accenture and Capgemini, they're also predicting slower growth.
So is this a sign that the whole IT sector is struggling? Or is India just, uniquely vulnerable in this situation?
That's the million-dollar question, right? While there are some broader global trends at play, the factors we've been talking about, the reliance on the U.S. market, the potential for AI disruption, those make the Indian IT sector particularly vulnerable at the moment.
So it's not just about riding out a global economic downturn. It's about Indian IT firms, adapting and finding ways to innovate and stay competitive.
Exactly. The companies that can figure out how to integrate AI into what they offer, diversify their client base, and move up the value chain, those are the ones that are going to, really thrive in this new landscape.
It feels like a pretty crucial moment. But there's one more piece I want to bring up. The U.S. Federal Reserve, the Fed, their decisions on interest rates, they have a pretty big impact on the global economy, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The Fed's actions, they ripple across the world, including the IT sector. For a while there, investors were hoping the Fed would cut interest rates to boost economic growth. And that, indirectly, could benefit IT spending.
Because lower interest rates mean it's cheaper for companies to borrow money and invest in those IP projects, right?
Exactly. But, inflation is being stubborn, like a house guest that won't leave, so the Fed is having to hold off on those rate cuts. And that means companies are going to be more hesitant to borrow and spend, which just adds more uncertainty to the IT sector.
It's like this high-stakes balancing act for the Fed, right? They got to try to control inflation without tipping the whole economy into a recession. And their decisions are going to have some serious consequences for the IT sector, both in India and globally.
Yeah, it's a complex scenario, lots of moving parts. And understanding these forces at play, it's pretty crucial for anyone who's interested in the future of the tech industry.
It's a lot to digest, for sure. But I think it's incredibly important to be aware of these factors, whether you're an investor, a tech professional, or just someone who likes to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, it's a big story for sure, and it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, but we got to remember there are real people whose lives are directly impacted by all this stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're talking about, young tech professionals who have built their whole careers in this industry, families whose livelihoods depend on it, and their futures. I mean, they're tied to how well these companies can navigate these challenges.
It makes you think about the whole situation differently when you consider that human element, right? I mean, we're not just talking about some abstract economic forces, it's about real people and their dreams and their hopes.
And it's not just the economic side of things either. There's a political dimension to all this too.
Yeah.
Didn't one of the sources mention something about Donald Trump and tariffs?
Right. Yeah. The possibility of Trump returning to the White House, it's adding another layer of uncertainty to the whole mix. His America First policies, especially his focus on bringing jobs back to the U.S., that could have a, significant impact on the Indian IT sector.
Well, because Indian IT relies so heavily on outsourcing contracts for U.S. companies, right? If Trump is reelected, could we see like a resurgence of those trade tensions and tariffs that really disrupted global trade a few years back?
It's a scenario that investors are definitely keeping an eye on. I mean, a more restrictive trade environment, it would make it tougher and more expensive for Indian IT firms to do business with American companies. And that could, potentially impact their revenue and profitability.
It just reminds you how interconnected the global economy really is. Political decisions in one country, they can create these ripple effects that are felt all over the world.
Exactly. And it underlines the need for Indian IT firms to kind of spread their wings a little bit, diversify their client base, and reduce their reliance on any single market.
So it's not just about adapting to technological change, it's also about managing these geopolitical risks. Seems like a lot to juggle.
It is, but let's zoom out for a second and think about the role of global IT giants in all this.
You mean companies like Accenture and Capgemini? Yeah, the source mentioned that they're also predicting slower growth.
Right. And that suggests that the challenges that the Indian IT sector is facing they're actually part of a bigger trend that's affecting the whole industry.
So it might not be that India is losing its competitive edge. It could be that there's just like a fundamental shift happening in the demand for these traditional IT services overall.
Yeah, that's a key insight. As companies around the world are embracing this digital transformation and all these new technologies like AI and cloud computing, their needs are evolving, right? They're looking for more specialized and strategic IT solutions, and those solutions can often be found closer to home.
So Indian IP firms can't just compete on cost anymore. They need to offer something unique, something valuable to stay relevant in this new environment.
Absolutely. They've got to move up the value chain, develop specialized expertise, and focus on innovation to stand out from the crowd.
Sounds like they need a major strategic rethink to adapt to this new playing field. But it makes me wonder if the demand for traditional IT services is shrinking. What's driving the growth of the global IT sector as a whole? There's got to be something else fueling that, right?
You're right. While traditional IT services might be facing headwinds, other parts of the industry are like exploding right now. You've got areas like cybersecurity, data analytics, cloud computing, and of course AI. Those are all booming.
So the IT sector isn't shrinking, it's more like it's evolving, it's shifting towards these new areas.
Exactly. And the companies that can anticipate and adapt to those changes, those are the ones that are going to grab the biggest slice of this evolving market.
Feels like there's a lot of opportunity amidst all this uncertainty.
Oh, for sure. But to make the most of those opportunities, it's going to take agility, innovation, and a willingness to kind of embrace new technologies and business models.
And maybe a little bit of luck too.
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe. But I think the most important ingredient is the ability to really grasp the forces that are at play here and to make strategic decisions that align with these emerging trends.
That makes sense. But let's pull back even further and think about the big picture.
Mhm.
What does all this mean for the future of the Indian economy overall?
Yeah, that's the big question. The IT sector has been a major engine of growth for India for decades, right? It's created tons of jobs, attracted foreign investment, and helped fuel the country's rise as a global economic power.
So if the IT sector stumbles, could it have a ripple effect on the whole Indian economy?
It's definitely a risk that policymakers need to be thinking about. But I'm optimistic. I think India has the potential to navigate this transition and come out stronger.
You're sounding pretty hopeful. What makes you so confident?
Well, there are a few things. First, India has this massive pool of talented engineers and tech professionals. It's a huge asset, one that can be harnessed to, develop these new technologies and services.
So it's about retraining, upskilling the workforce so they have the skills they need for this new digital economy.
Exactly. And second, India has this thriving startup ecosystem. These young companies, they're often more agile and innovative than the big established firms. They're experimenting with new technologies, exploring new markets, creating new solutions.
So they could become the new drivers of growth for the Indian IT sector.
I think so. And then you have the Indian government, which is increasingly focused on promoting digitalization and innovation. They're investing in infrastructure, creating these favorable policies, and encouraging collaboration between industry and academia.
So there's a deliberate effort to create an environment that supports and nurtures technological advancement in India.
Right. And that's where things get really interesting. It's not just about India catching up with the rest of the world. It's about India becoming a leader in this new digital economy.
That's a pretty bold vision. What would it take for India to actually achieve that?
Well, it would require this ongoing focus on education, research, and development. You'd need investment in cutting-edge technologies like, AI, blockchain, and quantum computing. And it would take a willingness to embrace risk, to experiment, to try new things.
Seems like a huge undertaking.
It is, but it's also an incredible opportunity. If India can pull off this transition, it has the potential to become a global hub for innovation and technological advancement.
And that would have a really transformative impact, not just on the Indian economy, but on the lives of, millions and millions of people.
Absolutely. It's a story that's still being written, and I, for one, am excited to see how it unfolds.
Me too. But before we get too carried away with all these future possibilities, let's bring it back down to earth for a minute and address the elephant in the room, the stock market crash.
Ah, yes, the reality check. It's easy to get lost in the long-term potential, but we can't forget about the immediate challenges facing the Indian IT sector right now.
The Nifty IT Index, it's currently in bear territory. And some of these major IT firms, they've lost billions of dollars in market value. That's a tough pill to swallow.
It is, and it's creating a lot of anxiety among investors, especially those who bet big on the continued growth of this sector.
So what's the outlook for these stocks? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
It's hard to say for sure. The market, it's volatile, lots of factors influencing it.
But surely the experts have some thoughts on this, right?
Oh, they do. But their opinions are all over the map. Some analysts think that the worst is behind us and that this recent dip in IT stocks actually presents a buying opportunity. Their argument is that the long-term fundamentals of the industry are still strong and that this current wave of pessimism is overblown.
So they're basically saying now's the time to buy low and wait for the eventual rebound.
Exactly. But there are other analysts who are more cautious, more wary. They believe that the problems facing the IT sector are they're more structural, more long-lasting, and that this downturn is just the beginning of a longer decline.
They're saying investors need to be careful not to jump in too quickly and get caught in a falling market.
Precisely. And they point to things like, the looming recession in the US, the threat of AI taking over jobs, and the high valuations of these IT stocks as reasons to be cautious.
So it's a real mixed bag of opinions. Who are investors supposed to believe? It's a tough call.
It is. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer here. Investing, it always involves some level of risk.
I guess that's why they call it a gamble.
Exactly. But even though we can't, predict the future of the stock market, we can still make smart decisions based on what we understand about the underlying trends, the potential risks, and the opportunities.
That's a good point. And I think that's what this whole deep dive has been about, providing context, insights, and giving our listeners a way to think about these complicated issues facing the Indian IT sector.
I agree. And I hope that it's given our listeners the information they need to make their own informed decisions, whether they're investors, tech professionals, or just people who are interested in understanding the forces shaping the world.
It's really amazing to see how all these different pieces fit together. But before we wrap things up, there's one thing that's been on my mind during this whole conversation. We've talked a lot about the economics, the technology, but what about the people, the human cost of this downturn?
Yeah, it's an important point. I mean, behind all the stock market numbers and industry jargon, there are real people whose lives are, being impacted by these changes.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, but we can't forget about those IT professionals, the ones who might be facing job insecurity right now, or the families who are feeling the pinch because of salary cuts or layoffs.
Exactly. Economic shifts, they don't just affect balance sheets, they affect lives. And in a sector that, employs literally millions of people in India, the human cost, well, it can be huge.
So what can be done to help? What are some solutions or strategies that could ease the burden on the people who are affected?
It's going to take a multi-pronged approach, a combination of government policies, industry initiatives, and just individual resilience. Governments can invest in retraining and upskilling programs, right?
Yeah.
Help those who have been laid off or displaced to learn new skills, the kind that are in demand now.
So it's about equipping people with the tools they need to adapt to the new job market and find those new opportunities.
Exactly. And the industry itself can help too. They can support these initiatives, create new jobs in those booming areas like, AI and data analytics, and they can foster a culture of lifelong learning within their companies.
And individuals, they can take charge of their own careers, be proactive, seek out those new skills and opportunities, and just try to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about having that growth mindset, being willing to adapt and evolve as the world changes around you.
It's a good reminder that even when things are tough, there are always opportunities for growth, for reinvention, if you're willing to, embrace them.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a powerful message, a hopeful message for our listeners today.
For sure. So if you're listening and you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this talk of economic downturns and, all the changes happening with technology, just remember, you have the power to shape your own future.
Be proactive, be curious, and be open to those new possibilities that might come your way.
And don't be afraid to ask for help along the way. There are resources out there.
Because even though the future can feel uncertain, one thing is for sure. The human spirit, that drive to innovate and to overcome challenges, it always finds a way forward.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into India's IT sector. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
It was my pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for your time. Thank you for your curiosity. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the topics that, that really matter to you.